At Digital Science, we don't just care about individual bits of information. We really know the power of bringing all of that knowledge together. But none of that would be possible without a really strong research infrastructure. So, to tell us a little bit more about the power of metadata and persistent identifiers, we're joined today by the co founder of the More Brains Cooperative, Alice Meadows. Alice, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to start by asking whether you can tell us a little bit about you, your background, and yourself. What are you up to at the moment, and what has brought you to that role?
Well, thanks, Suze. It's lovely to have this opportunity. So, at the moment, for the past year or so, I have been working full-time, 4 days a week, which is wonderful, for the More Brains Cooperative, which is a small consulting organisation that I co-founded a few years ago with some friends and colleagues. Before that, I was at NISO, the National Information Standards Organisation, doing community engagement work for them for several years. And before that, at Orchid, several years doing a similar kind of job. And before that, my career was really all in scholarly publishing in sort of communications, marketing, that sort of area. Mm-hmm. So all scholarly comms related, but moving from publishing into more like sort of research infrastructure, and then morphing into consulting, which takes a bit of everything, which is really lovely.
Absolutely. So we first met because we both work and care passionately about community engagement. Can you tell us in your own words a little bit, I say a little bit, it's huge really, about what that entails, who you collaborate with, and the kinds of things that you are trying to do as a community engagement professional?
Well, I mean, I guess I feel community engagement is should be at the heart of everything we do. It doesn't matter what you do. If you don't bring your community or communities along with you, it's going to be much harder to succeed. You know, you can make people do things, you can mandate things, you can require them, but on the whole, that doesn't tend to be as successful as if you try to engage with them as early on as possible in the process, listen to what they have to say, what they need. You can't always fulfill all their needs, but at least you're aware, they feel heard, and you're much more likely to then bring them along with you. It's very kind of you to refer to me as a community engagement professional. I'm not professionally trained in any way, and you can now get professional training in community management and community engagement, which is fantastic. But I think it's more something that I've kind of done a version of throughout my career, and then it's become more and more the focus of a lot of what I do, and I really love it. So.
It's hilarious that you, of all people, still could not say that you are a community engagement professional. You're one of those people that we all look up to and often ask for advice from as well. The number of times I've asked you about things, I lost count of the number of times. And so tell me a little bit about your consultancy role within More Brains, because it is a collaboration of different people from across the research landscape, really, isn't it? And you take on a whole range of different challenges by bringing all of those brains together. Tell us a little bit more about what you're doing there.
So More Brains is myself and 3 colleagues, as you say, from across. So Josh Brown and I work together at Orchid. He's a librarian by training, and he has also worked in research infrastructure and some funding organisations. Phil Jones has more of a publishing background, and you worked with him, I think, at Digital Science. He was at Digital Science for some time, and he has more of a sort of technical producty type of background. And then Fiona Murphy and I worked together at Wiley for some time, and she is sort of a proper publisher, an editorial publisher with a strong background in data science in particular. So I think we all have quite sort of complementary and slightly overlapping, but not too overlapping realms of experience and expertise, which collectively make us, I think, give us a lot of opportunities. And I also love the fact that, as you say, we now work across all the different elements in the research space. So we do work for funders, we do work for infrastructure providers and vendors, we do work for publishers and societies and libraries and institutions. And I love that sort of intellectually as something that's really interesting. But I also think it's very valuable because it means if we're doing a project for a funder, we can bring our kind of context from the other parts of the ecosystem into the work that we do, which as I say, makes it more interesting, but I think also adds value for the client, which I really like. The other thing that was very important to all of us when we set up More Brains was we very much wanted to start off with our shared values. So we'd all, I think, been in positions or found ourselves in situations where our values weren't aligned with the organisations that we were working for one reason or another. Not that there was anything wrong with those organisations, but you sometimes get to a point where you're like, I'm not quite sure this is quite right for me. So when we first started talking about, working together more formally, we started by having that values conversation and identifying what our shared values were, and then we built the organisation out of that. And that's why we are formally a cooperative. We're Wolverines Cooperative, but we literally are a member of Cooperatives UK. I have to say they were very bemused and did not really know what to do with a consulting, a scholarly communications consulting company that wanted to be a cooperative, because they're set up for retail and agriculture and things. So it was quite. There were a lot of hoops that we had to kind of change a little bit in order to jump through them successfully and get our cooperative membership.
And I presume the decision was because you wanted to make sure that it was more community-minded almost.
Yes, community-minded, equitable, inclusive, all those things were very important to us, yeah.
Because all of those values really do lead to better scholarly communications, better research, better collaboration and building on all of those amazing things and turning all of that research knowledge into sort of tangible, impactful things for society. So I think it's brilliant. Taking just a step back, I suppose, you talked about your time at Orchid and at NISO, and that's what actually brought us together. That's how we had the pleasure of meeting for the first time, and you were incredibly brave. The first conference that we attended together, which was Pidapalooza, I think it was Dublin?
Yeah,
was it 2019?
It was before that. I think it was probably 2018.
It was 2019. Because I think Reykjavik was 2018. So I think it was 2019. And I was at Digital Science, so it must have been Yes, it was 2019. And the bravery comes in you thinking it was a brilliant idea for me to do the wrap-up plenary.
That was me being brave. That was you being brave.
And the reason I bring that up is because one of the stories that I talked about in my plenary, in kind of grounding where I was coming from at my first Pidapalooza, was that 5 months ago, before I started at Digital Science, before Pidapalooza, I had no idea what a PID even was. So when my CEO, Daniel Hook, said, it'll be great to get you involved in Pidapalooza, I had to say, that's great, I'll absolutely take that on. And then very swiftly Googled, what is a PID? And I think that's really telling, because I'd spent so long in research, and yet I had no idea that the world of persistent identifiers really existed, let alone the value of that in underpinning and enabling all of the research infrastructure that allows us to do the work that we do. So can you tell me, for people that don't know, or for people that may not want to Google it like I did, what is a persistent identifier?
The persistent identifier is basically a very nerdy description of it, an alphanumeric string of numbers and letters that uniquely identify a person, a place, or a thing. So a person might be, in our world, a researcher or some other contributor to research. I am not a researcher, but I do contribute to research, so I can have my Orchid ID or whatever. A place would be an organisation where a researcher works, or where research is conducted, or that funds research, something like that. And then a thing is pretty much anything else. So, an output, a publication, a data set, a geological sample, a piece of equipment, anything that is associated with research in our world. So a persistent identifier will uniquely identify whatever those things or people or places are, and then really importantly, it should resolve to more information about them. That additional information is called metadata, and in a way that's much more important than the PID, the persistent identifier itself. And in fact, any one PID on its own is kind of not very valuable at all. It's like having a sort of longitude and latitude. I've no idea. I'm making this up, showing my ignorance. 240 degrees south, 310 degrees west. It doesn't mean anything. But if you put some more information around that, it becomes really, really valuable, and you can pinpoint the exact person, place, or thing.
Mm-hmm. And so, as you said, ORCID is the perfect and very much the most widely adopted individual researcher identifier. We've worked on developing things, and you've seen changes, across your time working in this space around things like research organization registry identifiers, so RAW.
Yep.
That's something that Digital Science were very proud to be a part of, and we helped contribute the grid database, yep. which funnily enough we'd created just to enable dimensions to work, really, but to be able to then contribute that and contribute it to being something bigger and more community owned and driven was a real privilege for us as well. But I have to say, as a researcher, the digital object identifier, the DOI, was the only thing I really knew about. I had no idea truly of the value of those things. And I think the fact that you bring metadata up as well is really important. I remember when I was a researcher putting a paper in for publication and being faced with all of those fields of information that they require. And I truly had no understanding of how valuable all of that metadata is. So you've kind of touched on why it's exciting and important, but can you tell me about what good metadata can drive, what it can lead to?
I wrote a blog post for the Strong Kitchen a few years ago called something like How Metadata Can Save the World, which was a little bit of a stretch, but actually not that much of a stretch, because if you have good information about information, good metadata, it's so powerful. It enables you to discover stuff. It enables you to make connections between stuff. There's a woman called Melissa Hengel who, she's just moved organisations. I can't remember where she is now, but she had this amazing story that she used to tell about how really good metadata helped basically cure this bizarre illness that some young woman or young man had, that nobody could figure it out. But by using the metadata that was available, good metadata, they managed to make these connections and figure out, here's what's the matter with them, and cure it. So I wish I could remember that story in more detail, I'm sorry. But I think, good research, I think, is a lot about making connections between things. It's not about something completely novel, although I'm sure that's wonderful as well. But, it's that whole building on the shoulders of giants thing where, you've got this vast array of information, but in order to make sense of it, you need to be able to identify the bits in it that relate to the work that you're doing. And you need to be able to do that quickly and accurately and feel that it's reliable. And you need to be able to acknowledge the other people who contributed to it. So metadata makes all that stuff possible. You can't do any of that easily anyway without good metadata.
Absolutely. I think that the thing I love is that it really does start to break down the silos of knowledge as well that we find ourselves stuck in. That you go to a conference and you're in a very narrow strand of a very niche area of something you already know about, everyone in the room, you've already read their papers. But really diving into research information and using sort of metadata around, a category of research or a particular health condition or something can actually lead you to discovering things outside of your sphere of knowledge, but in a really complementary way, stuff that you can build upon. I'm really glad you talked about acknowledgement and credit as well, because just taking a step back from the metadata and back to persistent identifiers, how do you think PIDs are helping support a sort of more open and a more collaborative research landscape while ensuring that people are getting credit for the amazing work that they're putting out there in whatever form?
Well, I think when I talk about PIDs, I usually implicitly am talking about open PIDs. And by that, I mean PIDs that, ideally, in my view, have open governance, but in particular have open metadata. So metadata, I should have said, is really only valuable if it's accessible, if people can use it. If it's sort of hidden away, it's not really of any use to anybody. But assuming that the metadata is open and assuming that it is good, and for example, it includes things around information around provenance, who added this metadata, when was it added, where was it added, has it been checked by anybody, has it been updated, that kind of information that allows you to know whether you can really trust it. So a good example is on ORCID records, you can add mostly you can add your own information to audit records, and that's probably going to be trustworthy. I'm sure 99% of people who have an audit ID add information that is, legitimate, and probably most of the 1% who don't, it's mistakes, it's typos and things. But if something is added by a trusted organisation, maybe it's that institution saying, oh yeah, they really do work here, that, particularly in combination with what a researcher or a contributor says about themselves, is a really valuable way of both demonstrating provenance in a way that then elicits trust in that information. So I think that's one really important part in terms of openness. Be open, be transparent, and then be reliable. It also works in terms of acknowledgement, I think, because if you know whom you're crediting, the institution that they work for, who funded their work, that enables you to acknowledge and for everybody to receive the recognition that they deserve for their part that they played in it. There's an initiative which I know you're familiar with called Credit, which actually is now an ISO standard, which is the contributor roles taxonomy, and that has gone some way towards really helping to do that for roles that aren't just around writing papers, because that's the kind of classic way that a researcher in particular will get credit, whether it's in terms of promotion and tenure or a grant or whatever. It's very, very often built around what papers they've published and where they've published them. But there are so many other people who contribute really valuable efforts to a research project, and the credit taxonomy helps to support that through metadata. So that's another example of how metadata can really, I think, push us all to be more open and transparent, while at the same time having information that's reliable and allows this genuine kind of recognition and attribution.
You've mentioned NISO, it is this standards organisation. Can you tell me a little bit about the importance of having an organisation or a network of organisations even that really oversee the development and the engagement with these ways of everybody working together interoperably?
I mean, it's sort of it's kind of an obvious thing to say, but if you don't have an overarching organisation, everybody does their own thing. I mean, we've all been stymied by having the wrong plug in the wrong country or whatever. The same holds true for everything, and I'm, as I think many of us that work in our space, I'm a great believer in, look, we probably aren't going to get anything that works 100% of the time for 100% of the people, but if we can make stuff work for most of the people most of the time, so that you're not having to constantly reinvent the wheel and figure out your own way of doing things, that's got to be a good thing. And so organisations like NISO and organisations like the PID, organisations that have best practices that they share, again, these are open things. People aren't required to use them, but on the other hand, they don't have to pay to use them either. So, it's in all our best interests to use these best practices, to use these standards, so that we can collectively benefit from them, as well as individually, I would say.
A huge amount of the work that you have done, either yourself or the teams that you have worked with and that you've developed, have really helped better understand the barriers to understanding the value and maybe then the adoption of these persistent identifiers, of people like me that used to find the metadata fields a real chore to try and fill in. Can you tell us a little bit about the challenges there? Because I imagine there may be some inequity in how people are able to adopt those things. How have you seen that play out across the sort of global research landscape, and what initiatives have you encouraged to help people on that journey?
Quite a lot of questions in that, I think. So to answer the last one first, in terms of global inequities, I think that's a really, really important thing. And I think we would probably all agree that most of the research infrastructure that's in place has been built by and for essentially scientists in the global north who are English language speaking. I mean, that's a bit crass, but honestly, that probably holds true for digital science as much as anyone else. I think one of the very encouraging things in recent years has been an increasing awareness that that's not okay, that there are subjects other than science, and there are countries other than the UK and the US, and there are languages other than English. But it's always harder to kind of retrofit stuff. So once you've built something for a certain community, and then you try to kind of bolt on stuff to make it work for others. It's helpful, but it's not as good as it is if you start from scratch and really build something that works for the communities for which it's intended. And I think that certainly DataCite, I'm on the community engagement steering group for DataCite, and Orchid and Crossroad have similar initiatives, but I'm closest to the DataCite one because I'm familiar with that. So they have started to award grants basically to organisations in the Global South who are doing work to help build PIDs or use PIDs in their community. And there's some amazing stuff. I reviewed some of the first sets of grants, and honestly, the work that these organisations are doing is so inspiring, and they don't need an awful lot of investment. I mean, in dollar terms, it's not huge amounts of money. What they can achieve with that is wonderful. So I think, making that effort to go out to those other communities, the same is true in the humanities space. There's amazing stuff happening in humanities on tiny little budgets. So I feel like we have this huge opportunity, and that there's increasing awareness that we should take this opportunity to, not stop serving scientists, obviously, but to be more inclusive of other disciplines, of other communities, of other countries, of other languages, etc.
I'm so glad you talked about that, because one of my favourite stories that I always think about around metadata is the longevity of information that we're putting out there, the sustainability of it, and how much we may already have lost. And the story I remember is around somebody that was cataloguing old films, and they had a database that they'd sort of crudely created slightly retrospectively because they'd realised they had all of this information to categorise, and they realised how much of it they'd already lost. So I'm really glad that you talked about that. That talk resonates with me so much, because we did have people from the arts and humanities coming in and say, we've tried this, and this person was sharing their experiences, and the scientists in the room were actually going, we've got an awful lot to learn. And it was brilliant and refreshing and wonderful. So talking of sustainability and the fact that information across the world, not just in research, but in everything that we do, is being produced at this unprecedented rate, how do we keep on top of it all?
We don't, do we? But, of course, I'm going to say that metadata can help with that, because if you have, I'm sorry, I'm going to sound like a broken record, if you have good metadata attached to those articles and publications and other outputs, it enables you to quickly find your way to the bits that you need. Because, I mean, honestly, I guess AI machines can read all this stuff, but, people can't read in that quantity. And, you think back, so I'm going on a little tangent here, but when you think back to, 20, 30 years ago, digital humanities couldn't have happened. That people used to write theses about, incredibly esoteric things like the use of the comma in Shakespeare's plays, and they would have to go through and manually count them up and, remember where they were and all the rest of it. And now you can get a machine to do all that work for you, and then you can analyze the results, and you can put that sort of human emphasis on it. That's where I was going with this, but anyway. I think metadata is the answer to everything, really. So this is the short answer.
I really love that. You have mentioned AI. We are living in a world where AI should hopefully accelerate a lot of our workflows, make things easier and more efficient. And certainly we can understand how metadata can help information retrieval and the relevance of that information retrieval if it's built properly, if it's been contributed to properly. And that's wonderful. But we're also living in a world of things like generative AI, which we know can provide hallucinations of things that look like they could be research information, but aren't always. We also know that there's sort of inadvertent misinformation and quite active disinformation being fed into the system and challenging what we can consider to be truth in research. So in order to help people better understand whether a piece of research information is trustworthy and credible, you've mentioned it already, provenance is hugely important. Can you tell me a little bit more about how metadata really can sort of step up to that challenge?
Well, I think metadata is part of it. I think the other side of it is is a sort of human understanding of why that's important. And you've mentioned that a couple of times in terms of, from an input perspective, as a researcher, understanding why you're being asked to provide this information. It's just like another job you have to do. It's kind of, it can be burdensome. But I think, we all know that what you get in is what you get out. The same is true for metadata as of any kind of data, really. So being able to rely on that metadata that's been included, as we've said before, rely on the provenance of it, but then also make sure that the people who are using that information know to check that information. So there's no point in having provenance if it's not then used as part of the way AI is used. So we need to train AI to actually check for things like provenance, check for who this information came from, check for how it was generated. And then I think that metadata can be part of the solution, but it's not on its own, it's never going to be enough.
When we think about persistent identifiers, and thinking back to your time at ORCID and of course your time at NISO, and now being able to leverage all of that experience and information at More Brains, having the adoption of the ORCID ID as the researcher identifier was a massive game changer for research. Can you tell us a little bit about the things you're particularly proud of, the impact that has had on research and what it's enabled?
So, there are some very practical things that I love about ORCID. I will say, we all the persistent identifiers, there's still, I don't think anybody can be or would be complacent about. There's still a long way to go on widespread adoption, and as I said before, any one PID on its own is really not terribly valuable. But looking across the landscape, I think you're right. ORCID has been a game changer. It has a lot of researcher recognition, which is fantastic. And one of the things that I think has been a great success is the auto-update functionality in ORCID. I don't publish a huge amount, but I do publish. And I love the fact that sometimes I've forgotten I've published something and I'll get a little ping in my email inbox and it says, hey, your ORCID record has been updated. And I literally don't have to lift a finger. I once signed up to allow Crossref and data science to update my ORCID record, and now it just happens. So, it sounds like a small thing, and it is a small thing for any one individual researcher to do. But actually, I'm sure if you calculated the number of hours that must save across the world in terms of researchers not having to do that work themselves, it's huge. Now, on the flip side of that, there's still, so I think work to push information to ORCID records has been very successful. I think that work to pull information from ORCID records has been less successful as far as I can tell. And I haven't been at ORCID for several years now, but this still seems to be the case. And I think there's some perfectly valid reasons for that. Like a lot of ORCID records still have very little information in them, and perhaps what's there hasn't been validated, so people are a little loath to use it. But actually, it's only when that pulling from ORCID is happening, as well as the pushing too, that we'll really see the value. And that, I think, that will be another game changer. That will be the point when researchers will really be like, oh, I get it. I go and I apply for a research grant, and look, I just press a button. I put my ORCID ID, and they pull the stuff out. I say, yes, use this, delete that, and I'm done. And there's a wonderful story which you may have heard that the Australian Research Data Commons ALDC people use. We did some work for them on cost-benefit analysis for widespread PID adoption in Australia, and as part of that, they shared this fantastic story by a guy called Joe Shapter, who used his ORCID ID when applying for an ARC grant, Australian Research Council grant, and they have fully integrated ORCID, so it is a push-pull thing. And he estimates that he literally saves 3 to 4 days applying for a grant by using his ORCID ID, because they pull all that publication information, review information, institution information, grant information comes in automatically, and he doesn't have to key it himself. So I think stories like that really shine a light on the value of PIDs when we can really harness the full power of them. And we are not there yet, but we do have proofs of concept. We can see it's working, so hopefully we will get there.
It's amazing when you think about that being just one individual researcher and then scale that up across this global endeavour. It's huge.
Yep.
One thing I would love to ask you just before I ask you my final question is that research infrastructure, by necessity, has an opportunity to be quite dynamic and to really respond to the needs of researchers and new ways that we're doing research in a way that kind of research culture can sometimes be more resistant to. What is it about the organizations involved in kind of reinforcing research infrastructure that enables them to keep doing that? Because they're so influential on how we do research these days.
Gosh, that's a great question. I mean, I think you often get people who are very, very passionate. I think, research infrastructure attracts a slightly different kind of nerd from research. And very often it is people who formerly were researchers who saw a problem that was preventing them from doing their work as efficiently as they wanted to. And I think this is the case with probably all the digital science companies and many others as well. And so they wanted to come up with a solution. Now, those solutions don't always work or don't always work in the long term. They don't have enough investment or whatever. And I think there is a whole question about sustainable investment in research infrastructure. But I do think that very often those infrastructure organisations were developed by people and organisations that felt very passionately we need to be better at supporting researchers, so not the doing of it, but actually enabling researchers to do it better, more efficiently, more effectively, and to disseminate it more efficiently, more effectively. And I'm personally a great believer in the power of passion. I think, a lot of passion combined with a decent amount of expertise can get you a very long way. I think sometimes the reverse is less true. I think you can have a huge amount of expertise, but if you're missing the passion, it's not necessarily going to be as easy to get you where you want to be.
Yeah, that's so relatable. My final question is this. What would you like to see for the future of research in terms of research infrastructure for the next 5 or 10 years?
I guess I would like to see more joined upness. More, I think this is where standards come into it. I know for example, the PID organisations do some stuff together, and I think they would like to do more. But I would like to see less filing and more connections. More, let's look at this as a sort of whole world, whole community issue. So one of the things that, at least in my experience, very often happened both at NISO and at ORCID was that, particularly in large organisations, but not exclusively, one person would be responsible for the ORCID relationship, and somebody maybe in a different department and maybe a different country was responsible for the cross-ref relationship and the data set. So there's no kind of infrastructure strategy within those organisations. And I think this is one of the very powerful thing about the national PID strategies that have been, now become a thing and something that we've been quite involved in, which has been fantastic. But the sort of impetus behind them, and the reason why I think they're so important, is it's people saying, look, it's not okay to just do a little bit over here and a little bit over here. We need to have a proper national strategy that joins it all up and really helps our whole community at the national level benefit. And I know, science research is global, so national isn't enough, but actually national, if you can get it working at the national level, that will be a giant step forward to making it work globally. So I think that's a very long-winded answer, but I think that would be my wish, and I do think it's achievable. I think we're making progress towards achieving that.
And you're playing a massive part in enabling that already, which is brilliant to see. A huge part. Alice Meadows, thank you so much for chatting with me today. It's been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.